Let's get started talking more about research and theory in human growth and development. Theories and research have similarities in all disciplines, but there are always foundational principles that relate to specific areas. In this case, we are discussing human growth and development. The theories and research presented here are foundational to the study of growth and development and will be continued throughout the semester. Let's begin by reviewing your learning objectives for this week. First, you should be able to describe the purpose of theories in research and two theoretical issues on which developmental scientists differ. You should be able to summarize the main theories of human development. You should be able to describe methods developmental researchers use to collect data and the advantages and disadvantages of each, and explain ethical guidelines for research. The last two bullets will be explained in an additional video. By exploring the important underlying issues, and theoretical perspectives, it is easier to follow the research and even identify potential gaps in research. It's also important to address ethical issues in research. While we now have in place protections for human subjects research, prior standards have at times failed us, and there has been research that is considered unethical, some of which you will hear about in this lecture. Through our study and practice, we hope to never repeat the unethical research again. I've often heard students say their theory class was a waste of time and of no use in their career. I cringe every time I hear it and think that the professor failed them. Theory is the framework that is necessary for all newly conceived research. In fact, all conceived research. In human growth and development, theory is the set of logically related concepts that seeks to organize, explain, and predict the data and thus the human behavior in which we are interested. If you learn these foundational theories, it will be easier for you to remember the information presented throughout the semester because it gives you a framework in your brain for categorizing information in a way that makes sense and helps you to connect the different pieces of information presented as we proceed through the semester with detailed reviews of growth and development at different stages. Theories and hypotheses are connected in research. The theories are what we use to imagine the research we want to do, to answer questions or fill in gaps. The hypothesis is a possible explanation for a phenomenon that is used to predict the outcome of research. In the research in growth and development, we will proceed with two assumptions. Are people active or reactive in their development? And is development either continuous or discontinuous? Whichever assumptions you use will impact the research. This is also important because as you read research articles, you can keep the information that you gain in mind. John Locke was a 17th century philosopher and physician who is known for his theory of mind and is credited for the conception of identity and the self. He said that a young child is a tabula rasa, or a blank slate. Thus, how a child develops is dependent on their experiences. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, an 18th century philosopher, believed that children are born noble savages and develop their own positive tendencies if not corrupted by society. This may be a slight overstatement of his views. He did not believe the savage stage was the first stage of development. He did not think morality came from society teaching it, but rather was natural. We try to perfect ourselves, including our views of self, in a moral way, and even in the same way, our imagination. Therefore, it is society that corrupts. The result today is that we have two approaches to human development, active and reactive. In reactive development, humans are seen as hungry sponges soaking up experiences that shape them over time, whereas reactive people create experiences because they are motivated to learn. It is not passively happening to them, but rather they are intentional and involved in the process. One way to think of this is playing sports. How might you imagine how to learn to play basketball from an active or a reactive perspective? Take a little time to think before progressing. Why is the distinction between development being continuous or discontinuous important? If you take a mechanistic view, then we are all like machines. We see development as being gradual or in small incremental steps. The early skills that we develop, we refine over time. So the theorist or the researcher or the nurse can make predictions about future characteristics based on past performance. A different approach to viewing development is that of organismic theorists who are focused on stage theories. Each stage is different. While each stage is different, they build on each other. And you can't skip a stage like you might skip steps if you were running up steps in a hurry. Another way to think of this is that you can't go from first base straight to home. You must go to second base, third base, and then home. There is no stealing bases. On the way to approach organizing the different theories, or one way to approach organizing different theories, is in the 5 perspectives presented to you in your textbook. They are psychoanalytic, learning, cognitive, contextual, and evolutionary or sociobiological. For example, psychoanalytic includes Freud's psychosexual theory and Erickson's psychosocial theory. In the table in the textbook, there is much more detail than what I've presented here. And this is one of those pieces of information that I highly encourage you to commit to memory. Because if you remember this one table, it will make it much easier throughout the semester to remember the developmental stages and how the different theorists approached childhood and adult development. And it will also help you as you proceed through your coursework and into other courses. Let's review a few of these theorists and see what they have to say. Freud was the first of the 2 psychoanalytic theories that will be covered. He believed we have 3 parts of our personality: the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is about pleasure. It is predominant in newborns. All newborns want pleasure, and they want immediate gratification. I'm hungry. Feed me now. The ego is a little more rational and will work to find ways to gratify the id. It begins to develop in the first year of life. By the time a child is 5 to 6 years old, the superego is developing. It's the part of our personality that knows the shoulds and the should nots and can make us feel a little bit anxious if we are not meeting its standards. Freud saw the ego as a mediator or a referee between the id, pleasure now, feed me now, and the superego, there is a right way to get pleasure. This isn't it. This internal battle can cause conflicts, and these conflicts occur in 5 predictable stages: oral, anal, phallic, latent, and genital. How one progresses through the first 3 stages and the level of gratification impacts the adult personality. The ideal is that one should not get fixated or stuck in any of these stages. Freud emphasized the importance of unconscious thoughts and feelings and the role of childhood experiences informing our personalities, as well as how we saw ourselves and others. If you look at these stages of Freud, oral is obviously the infant, focused on the mouth, sucking, swallowing, and basically taking care of eating and surviving. This is when the ego develops. He believed that, for example, people that got stuck in this phase might become nail biters or smokers. The anal phase focuses on the anus, withholding or expelling feces. The belief was if you either or overemphasize this area and for some reason are too gratified or not gratified enough, you may become obsessively clean, rigid to a schedule, or defiantly messy. The phallic stage focuses on the penis or clitoris, and it's about masturbation. This is when you hear about the Oedipus complex or the electric complex. And this is the stage when the child is identifying with the parents as and wanting to replace the parents. So the Oedipus complex, the male child, wants to replace the father. The electric complex is obviously the opposite. This is when the superego develops, and this is a time that when they pass through this, then you would expect to get to the last 2 stages. These are the 3 stages that, according to Freud, you should not want to be stuck in because this can result in fixation. The latent period is adolescence to adulthood. There is little or no sexual motivation present. This is an emotional calm and a time of intellectual and social exploration. And then the last phase is genital. It's focused on the penis and the vagina and sexual intercourse, and is about sexual relationships. And this is moving into adulthood. The next of the psychoanalytic approaches is Erickson's psychosocial development. And this is a chart I pulled from very well, and Joshua does some great graphics. So this is one of those graphics, and what you notice in the difference here is that there is always an opposite. Erickson had 8 stages of development that grew out of Freud's work. Erickson saw each stage as a crisis in personality or a major psychosocial challenge that occurred at a critical point in time. In his view, there is always a balance between the positive and the negative, and we always hope that the positive wins. Thus, you see in infancy trust versus mistrust, and in early childhood autonomy versus shame and self-doubt. In preschool, initiative versus guilt, and so forth into young adulthood, isolation and intimacy, and finally into your maturity, ego integrity versus despair. One important distinction between Erickson and Freud is that Erickson emphasized that development was lifelong. He argued that social and cultural factors influence the stages, and that addressing the crisis in each stage positions a person to focus and to be successful in the next stage. So if I'm successful in trust versus mistrust, it sets me up to deal with autonomy versus shame. Behaviorism has three prominent theorists: Pavlov, Watson, and Skinner. Behaviorism is learning theory that emphasizes the predictable role of environment in causing observable behavior. There are two different approaches: classical conditioning and operant conditioning. If we were in class, I would ask you to tell me the difference. Take a few minutes right now and review the slide. Make sure you understand the difference between classical and operant conditioning. Classical conditioning is learning based on associating a stimulus that does not ordinarily elicit a response with another stimulus that does elicit a response. The first example that we almost all learn is Pavlov's dog. Pavlov noticed that his dog drooled or salivated when he fed them. He then noticed they did that every time he came in the room to feed them. Finally, he did an experiment where he rang a bell when he fed the dogs. After a while, the dogs drooled if he rang the bell, even without food. Kind of like my cats. If I go to the kitchen, they ignore me. But if I open a can, they come running. They associate the sound of a can opening with food, and they react to the sound even in the absence of food. Of course, I didn't do this as an experiment, but I do find it funny. Watson, on the other hand, experimented on an 11-month-old by making it afraid of furry objects by associating them with a loud sound. The experiment would never be approved today and would be considered unethical. He believed that he could mold a child into anything he wanted it to be. So he basically made a loud sound at the presence of a fuzzy white object, and in the end, the child was afraid of mice and cats and rabbits and pretty much anything furry and white. He showed that fear could be conditioned. It was, and what he did was highly unethical. Today, that experiment would never be improved. In fact, today, I can't imagine anyone would even suggest doing it. Operant conditioning, on the other hand, is learning based on association of behavior with its consequences. The most simple example of this is a baby babbling and its mother smiling and paying attention. The positive reinforcement teaches the baby that making sounds gets its attention, and thus the behavior of the mom reinforces the behavior of the baby. If the behavior of the baby was punished, then it might be extinguished. Another way to extinguish the behavior would just be to ignore it. If there's no reward for it, then why repeat it? Skinner believed that animals and humans will repeat a response that is desirable and repress a response that is not. Social learning theory is also known as social cognitive theory. Bandura believed that, unlike the behaviorists, that learning is bidirectional, from person to the world and the world back to the person. He called this reciprocal determinism. Children not only learn by watching others and modeling their behavior, but they can take the pieces they learn from others and put them together to form their own styles. As they learn different standards, they are able to judge themselves and begin to master challenges and active goals of self-development. Now, this is important because it basically helps to explain how we get to self-efficacy, which is the sense of one's capability to master challenges and achieve your goals. And there are many groups that still use this type of training, even into adulthood, to teach people how to do things. If you ever went to a Zen center, you watch and you imitate and you do. It's rarely the case that you're given instruction on how to do. Likewise, if you ever took Aikido lessons, you learn by watching and by doing, and they rarely tell you exactly how to do what you're doing, but you learn through watching the instructor do it, as well as watching more senior peers to perform a behavior. Cognitive perspective is the view that thought processes are central to development. This is how one would apply new information or skills to situations and solve problems. One of the things you will often hear in nursing is that you need to think critically, or that it isn't just memorization, though memorization is a huge part of it, so don't be fooled. Cognitive learning involves comprehension, memory, and application. Cognitive learning theory is divided into two categories: social cognitive theory and cognitive behavioral theory. So remember, comprehension, think how the topic fits into a larger picture, why learning it matters. Memory, relate new information with your previous experiences to build deep knowledge, piece by piece, instead of cramming. And 3, application, apply the knowledge or skills to real-life situations and reflect on topics you are learning. Piaget was very interested in the scientific approach to learning, and thus much of his work with children is foundational knowledge in all of the health professions. He believed that children were born with the ability to adapt to the environment. People put things in categories as a system of knowledge, and over time create increasingly complex schemes of thought and behavior that is used for particular situations. He believed learning occurs in 4 qualitatively different stages: sensory-motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational. He saw formal logic, or the ability to use practical problem solving, wisdom, and the capacity to deal with ambiguous situations, as the outcome of mature development. You will learn more about these stages throughout the semester as you go through these different age groups. Social cultural theory stresses the role of children being actively engaged with the environment, While we learn through social engagement that engagement is in a cultural context. Let me repeat that. We learn through social engagement, and that engagement is in a cultural context. He believed that adults or more advanced peers were needed to help children and to organize their learning before the child would be able to master and internalize learning. He referred to a zone of proximal development to mean the difference between what a child can do alone and what a child can do with help. As you progress in your nursing and learn about nursing theory, you may come across Orum's self-care theory, which essentially proposes that nurses only do for the patient what they can't do for themselves. I hope that you get to the point that you will look back to this theory and you will relate the two. You support your patient until they can do it for themselves. Likewise, Vygotsky believes that parents, teachers, and others must support a child learning a task until that child can do it alone. He referred to this as scaffolding. His theories are especially important to early childhood education and in recognizing the importance of cultural experiences, values, and skills that a child learned. One of the important things to notice in this slide is that they point out social and cultural are two different words, and that you need both. These are important influences on development. The contextual perspective is the view that human development sees the individual as inseparable from the social context. John Bronfenbrenner's bioecological theory is an approach to understand processes and context of human development that identifies 5 levels of environmental influence. You will notice the developing child at the center, with micro, meso, exo, and macro systems surrounding the child and interacting. The impacts of the environment surrounding the child and the ability to affect the development of the child through different characteristics, talents, disabilities or abilities, and temperaments is important. Thus, the development of people in different cultures may mean all aspects do not apply to all people in every cultural group. I think your textbook also has a slightly different picture of this diagram, and it's a good way to help you understand how all the influences outside, from the ones in the inner microsystem circle that interact with the child or the individual or the family every day, influence them, all the way to the macro system, which are attitudes and ideologies of the culture and how they influence the growth and the development of every human being. Evolutionary sociobiology basically is the human development that focuses on evolutionary and biological basis of behavior. The theory is influenced by Darwin's theory of evolution and combines anthropology, ecology, genetics, and more to explain adaptive value of behavior. If you've never read On the Origin of a Species or Descent of Man by Charles Darwin, You should add them to your reading list. The more you know about the great thinkers in history, the more you will understand human development and how we think and learn. Darwin proposed that species develop through survival of the species. Those that survive and reproduce pass on their characteristics in their genes. Over time, there are incremental changes in the characteristics of the species. This can be true with behavior that we develop as protective mechanisms, such as women's aversion to certain foods during pregnancy. This could have been due to certain toxins in foods. Etiology is the study of adaptive behavior in animals that have evolved to increase their survival. One example is proximity seeking, where animals stay close to their moms during growth for protection, and this can include the attachment of babies to their moms in humans or imprinting of ducklings on their moms. We've come to the end of this piece. Always read your textbook for important information. Obviously, everything in the textbook is not covered in this presentation. I will post other information about research methods.